Hi everyone, it's Madeline. The last time we spoke, I spoke to you guys about my capstone project involving the Texas voter ID law, specifically known as SB 14. Since we last met, I've conducted my interviews and I've also participated in my fieldwork. And I'd really like to talk to you guys more about the conclusion that I had started to draw upon in the last time that we talked, but I've really developed a good argument for why I believe it should be the solution. So I really wanted to talk to you guys about that. So, to get us started, I want to talk about a little bit why I chose the subject of voter ID law and whether or not the Supreme Court should really rule on this Texas voter ID law, SB 14. So, I've always had a keen interest in constitutional law and specifically the Supreme Court that sprung from when I was really young, early in high school. But in addition to just my personal interests in constitutional law, I've always been interested in wanting to learn more so that I can educate myself and hopefully become an ally for people who feel like they are not as privileged as other people in American society due to systematic racism in America's history with voter suppression that really stems from that idea of systematic racism that stems back all the way to slavery and the Civil War and the Jim Crow era. So I've really been interested in that, and I have had a lot of thoughts about voter ID law and the way it contributes to America's history with those kinds of issues. And also because at heart I'm a feminist, and feminism is about equality, and it's about bringing people together and fighting for the strength in other people and fighting for the rights of other people so that people can have the same access to things that other people have always had access to or have always easily had access to. And I think that progress has always have to be made in America. So that's why I chose this voter ID law that was highly contentious at the time that I chose it. So moving on to my solution, I do believe, yes, the SB 14 should be struck down by the United States Supreme Court, specifically because of its discriminatory nature. The law affects too wide of a margin of marginalized people to be overlooked and seen as a solution to voter fraud. The number of people disenfranchised and the number of people who are taken away from the ballot who had previously been able to vote is too great a number to really legitimize that idea of voter fraud. However, I do believe that it's important to notice that voter ID laws do not inherently have to be racist or discriminatory in nature. I believe voter ID laws can be enacted to really try to help prevent this idea of voter fraud. But the issue comes into hand where it causes an undue burden on too many voters, and those voters are minorities, and those voters are people who live in poverty. The ethical value of equality, it's been something that America has stood for since its foundation, and we have struggled to achieve that notion of equality, but I believe that this is another stepping stone that we as a nation need to face to achieve that that point of equality. We as humans are inherently we treat people unequally, and I believe that it's important for us to try to overcome that. So that's why I believe that any kind of voter ID law that really does cause an undue burden on voters who have previously voted or a group of voters who have been members of society who have already been oppressed, specifically minority groups and specifically people who live in poverty. I believe that those laws need to be under strict scrutiny. And that's why I believe that SB 14 should be repealed by the Supreme Court. So, how did I come to the solution? Really, it happened through my fieldwork and through my interviews. I did a lot of research, and obviously that played a huge role, but it was really those pinnacle interviews that I had with people from either side of the situation spoke to me and really opened my mind to their ideas, and it gave me a clear idea of where I wanted to stand in this issue. And then, of course, my fieldwork comes into play with, like, what I can do as a person to help this situation. So I'll go right into my interviews. My opponent interview was conducted with Mr. Andy Hogg. He is the communications director for the Travis County Republican Party. He works with members from the local government level, City Hall, and then also with the state legislature people, members from Travis County, those representatives in our state capital, and talked about their party platform, their agenda as a party, and then also works to get the word out there since he is the communications director. So he was kind enough to meet with me. We met downtown near the Capitol in a little cafe, and he gave me about an hour of his time and spoke to me about SB 14. And he came to a couple clear points, which I want to bring out to you guys. The most important points from his argument were really specifically these 3 bullet points that I have on my PowerPoint here. The first one I'll talk about is he believes that if SB 14 were to be heard by the Supreme Court, he believes that it should not be repealed. However, interestingly enough, he does support something like a cleanup bill that would provide additional forms of identification that would then be accepted to allow people to vote. So expanding that short list of approved IDs that are currently under SB 14. He argues a very interesting argument that I had not heard before, the idea that voter ignorance is actually a bigger issue than voter suppression. I talk about voter suppression throughout my capstone paper. It really is that social problem that is at the base of these voter ID laws. And he argues that instead of worrying about suppressing people and hindering people from voting, we should really take a look at how instead we may be allowing people to vote who do not wish to vote, who do not have any knowledge of what they're voting for or who they're voting for or why they are voting for the people that they're voting for. So he argues that this ignorance in people coming into the ballot and making kind of these blind casts is a bigger effect on our democracy and a bigger effect on our representative government than maybe voter suppression does. It was an interesting argument. I had really never heard it before. But it went into his argument that said that the Constitution and the framers of the Constitution and the founders of our nation meant for landowners to be the ones who were voting. And since that notion doesn't really stand in modern society, the notion of still somebody having some kind of merit in order to vote does still stand. And he argues that voting isn't a free-for-all. It's a right given to us by this country, by our Constitution, and it needs to be protected by things like voter ID laws that prevent voter fraud, that prevent voter ignorance. And he, of course, made the argument that is the most popular argument for the opponents of this controversy, that voter fraud is such a widespread issue, and the little evidence that we have for it is actually incentive enough that we should really be enforcing these voter ID laws, because we don't know how widespread it is, and then these laws will act as a barrier to them. And he believes that any kind of voters that it disenfranchises, those voter ID laws are actually doing more help than they are doing any kind of hindrance because of the voter fraud that they are preventing. So his arguments were interesting, and I had never really heard a couple of them before, and it really opened my eyes to how people on the other side of this argument see and how they feel about things and the logical reasonings for why they think the way that they do. So I really appreciated meeting with him. And the next interview that I conducted was my proponent interview, and it was with Mrs. Elaine Wyatt. She is the president of the League of Women Voters Texas, which if you don't know anything about the League of Women Voters, it was started in the early 1900s during the women's suffragette movement in order to get women the right to vote. And they still focus on 2 main things: advocacy and education. They try to educate people about not only their right to vote and how to vote, but why they should vote and why it's important to vote and participate in government. And then also advocacy. So they try to get the word out there about elections that are coming up and who they're voting for and who's on the ballot and what are the issues on the ballot. Elaine really said something that really struck a chord with me, and I think it really set the foundation for the solution that I came to. It set the foundation for the ethical analysis that I did in my capstone paper. The quote was, "Anything that doesn't make it easier for someone to vote is a form of voter suppression." And I really took that to heart, and I thought about it because I really do think that when we disenfranchise voters, we disenfranchise the democracy. And it's not okay to say, well, since we're just disenfranchising this portion of people, we're protecting the free and fair elections. I don't think that it really correlates that way. I think that to have free and fair elections, we have to have free and fair elections. People have to be able to vote. And disenfranchising somebody who has been able to vote previously certainly doesn't do that. She also made the argument that a small subset of voter fraud prevented by voter ID laws is not significant enough to legitimize the law. She commented on, since there is such little evidence of voter fraud, the need for these laws is they're just seemingly unnecessary, and any kind of voter fraud that they do prevent then is just so minute that it doesn't actually legitimize the law. It doesn't make it relevant or current. It doesn't do enough good in respects to the harm that it causes. And she actually said something very interesting that I think is very possible that it actually could happen, and that was the idea that the SB 14 may become moot before being heard by the Supreme Court, and so it might not even be heard at all. And what she means by it becoming moot would be the Texas legislature would really act on it before the Supreme Court had a chance to hear it. Already, the legislature has bills in session right now involving election laws and voter laws, and the idea is that the legislator would act on it and change the law and maybe overturn SB 14 or change the face of it, spread it to, or widen it to make it more accommodating to more people, and then the Supreme Court wouldn't need to hear it because we took matters into our own hands. I thought that was really interesting and a very legitimate point, and I actually think that it's very likely that that could actually happen. So taking it into our own hands kind of leads me into my next point, which is me talking about my field work. And what I did for my field work was I went to a testimony training that was held at UT, and it was presented by Wendy Davis and a couple of members of the Planned Parenthood organization. And what this testimony training really was all about was testifying at the state legislature committee hearings. So when a bill is up in committee, they often file the bill for public testimony and public hearing. And that's when anybody from the public can come to the Capitol and they can get on an iPad and register to testify. And then they stand in front of the members of the committee and they argue why or why not they think that the legislation that the committee is hearing should be passed or should die in committee. So we learned about how to do it, and we learned tips on how to be a good testimony presenter, and we learned about why it's so important, and it really struck a chord with me because there were legislators at the event who spoke for themselves and said, legislators are representatives. They're elected by their constituents, and when their constituents come up into that committee room and they speak to the representatives and they tell their true stories, and they tell the effects of those laws that could go into order. When they say those things, those testimonies really do make a difference. And I think with something like voter ID laws and the disenfranchising of voters, testimony is something that is really important. Going to the Capitol, watching the legislation that is in the session currently, seeing what's involved with voter ID laws or election laws in general, going out, registering to testify, and then standing up and having a little bit of courage to stand in front of those representatives and say why you think that it is or is not a good law. It really does make a difference, and it gives us the ability to do something, and it gives us the ability to take this issue into our hands, because right now it seems like we're at this crossroads where either the law will go to the Supreme Court and it will be heard by the highest court in the land, or the Texas legislature will take it into their own hands and do something about it before the Supreme Court can even get to it. And I think that talking to your legislators, not only testifying, but calling them and telling them we need to do something about SB 14, that could really cause something to happen at the state level, and the Supreme Court wouldn't even have to get involved. What I learned really from all of this is that involvement matters, that voting and the process in our elective process in the United States is not perfect. There's no easy solution to it, but I believe that with public involvement, I think we can really do something about it to make it change and hopefully get towards a more equal and perfect union. What I learned from the specific capstone project was a lot of research, a lot of repetition, and a lot of understanding. And what I mean by that is that obviously my research skills have improved, I think, dramatically from this project. I've never done such a in-depth project where I had to do so much research. So I really do think that my research skills have improved because of that. And I'm very grateful for that because I'm sure it will come in handy in my future. Repetition was something that I really had a lot of difficulty with. It was my biggest challenge, I think, was overcoming the idea that I just repeat myself over and over again. And the points that I make, I feel like I'm just a record on repeat. And I have to come to terms with that. And I have to be able to identify it and change it when I can, but also understand that repetition is something that's important, that really does help get your point across. And repetition makes things clearer, and it's not always a bad thing. So that was something that I struggled with. And then understanding, I really took into account that, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so we can say what we want to say and we can argue our side, but we do have more ears to listen with than we do have mouths to speak. So I think it's important to hear the other side and try to understand what they feel about the issue, because their views are legitimate and their views are important. And I think it's really important to be able to analyze something from an objective standpoint, which was difficult for me because I know that I came in with some kind of implicit bias. So being understanding was really, I think, the biggest takeaway that I took away from this capstone project. So thank you so much for listening to me talk about my capstone project, my interviews, and my fieldwork, and my solution. And I hope that you enjoyed it and you know a little bit more about voter ID law. Thanks very much.